All right, everybody. I'm Steph. This is Tyler. We are here today to talk about an ongoing research project we've been working on that we're calling Does Let's Play Mean We Don't Play? Live Streaming's Impact on Video Game Sales. This is, like I said, it's ongoing work. So we'll be talking today about sort of what we've done with our data so far and sort of where the project is eventually headed as we continue to work through things. So a bit of our rundown, kind of what we'll chat about today. We definitely want to leave time for questions from you all as well. We'll talk a little bit about the overview of the video game content industry. So everything from, I know live streaming is kind of like in the title, as is Let's Play. And so we're looking at both of those things. So we'll give some current details on the status of that industry, then talk about some existing research on video game content audiences that are relevant to our work we're doing here, a little bit about video game content and copyright issues that are also relevant, and then basically we'll kind of walk you through what we've been doing with our study, the questions that we were interested in exploring, how we went about doing that. It gets a little heavy on the statistics, but Tyler will take over that and he's going to keep it accessible. So for those who are not stats minded like myself, don't worry. And then we'll talk about what we found so far and sort of what the roadmap for the future of this project is, in addition to what this hopefully means for those of you who are game developers, which I know is many of you here. And then, of course, like I mentioned at the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers and any thoughts or comments that you all might have. So a little bit about the VGC industry. So again, this is talking about both live streaming and any kind of gaming video content. So like if, YouTube gaming, whether that's a Let's Play video or video reviews or anything kind of falling under that broad umbrella is kind of what we're talking about here. And in the past 6 or 7 years now, right, both of these different types of video game content have become major revenue generators for the industry, right? So just as to give you some sense of that, right, of what kind of data we're talking about here, just this past year, so 2020, which of course was an interesting year for video game content in particular. The top 10 Twitch streamers together were earning over $12 million just in revenue from last year, right? Just the top 10. YouTube gaming saw its biggest year in its history with over 40 million active channels, 100 billion hours of gaming content watched in 2020, right? So these are both also projected to continue growing at a very rapid rate. At least one research institution, Juniper Research, has projected that the industry is going to exceed about $3.5 billion just a few years down the road. And already that industry together, the VGC industry, has eclipsed over $2 billion in worth, right? So we're talking about, as many of you know, again, a extremely lucrative subsector of the broader gaming industry. So I won't get too far down the rabbit hole with this. But I wanted to share some existing research that's been done on gaming spectators, which is a term I like to use to broadly refer to people who enjoy watching others play, whether that's live streaming or, again, whether that's video game content in general. And so, again, kind of relevant to our work here is some research done by a handful of scholars that have specifically looked into audience members' motivations for watching live streams. And a lot of it has tended to focus on players of video games. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But generally what's been found is much of what you would expect, right? People, much like often becomes their motivation for playing games, a lot of watching others play video games can be about tension release, right? So unwinding at the end of the day and kind of decompressing, depending on the game, of course, right? The social interaction component, much like, again, a multiplayer game, especially for platforms like Twitch, right? Having an active community or a chat has also been seen as a motivation or gratification for why people would engage in watching others play. Watching skilled players, so an appreciation for talented individuals. And in some cases, this goes hand in hand with information seeking. So that would be a player who, maybe is playing League of Legends, right, and trying to climb ranks, wants to basically learn and improve their skills by watching, pro players or maybe high elo players perform, right? So And many of these actually map on, interestingly enough, to traditional sport, right? So an appreciation for highly skilled players who are capable of doing things that people like me cannot, right? Which is getting high ranked in League. So other research has suggested that genre can actually have a big impact on these motivations. And again, this will become relevant to what we're talking about with watching streams or watching Let's Plays, is that some streamed or VGC content can have less demand, less cognitive load. So that's a media psych term that's referring to basically how much cognitive effort, right, users have to put in to engage with a piece of media. So, playing a really intense game, a really high-paced FPS game, right, can put a lot of cognitive load on an individual because you're having to monitor a map, right? You're having to coordinate, hand-eye maneuvers together, right? So there's a lot going on there sort of mentally. Whereas streams, at least certain genres that are very kind of chill, right, fun kind of stuff, might again offer sort of a de-stressing or relaxing kind of component. So more escapism, in other words, right? If you're looking for a relaxing format with that. So I did some research recently that just came out earlier this year where I was really actually interested in people who don't identify as players of games, but are nonetheless captivated by video game content, right? And so I was really fascinated in, okay, there's all this research, right, on why players, people who love video games, want to watch others play video games. But I was, hearing anecdotally about so many people who don't play games, right? Or maybe used to play and don't anymore, or have never touched a game in their life, but love being on Twitch or really love Let's Plays, right? And the long and short of it is I found out, a lot of social and psychological factors or barriers that sort of led to that, right? So, a big part of playing games is having the time, right, to invest into, a long game, right, or becoming good at a game. That realistically not everybody has, right? Especially people involved in caretaking positions, for example, right? As well as people's perceptions of their own skill. So a lot of my non-players I've talked to just say like, oh, I'm crap at games, right? I suck. So, why would I do that with my free time, right? It sounds terrible. I'd rather, just enjoy somebody else playing it. Because again, I can appreciate that, right? There's the value of skilled play that we saw even with players. And, sadly, but not surprisingly, toxicity in gaming, right? So even people, who we might think of as sort of outside of the gaming community, if you will, have heard, right, that gaming is not always the most hospitable space. And so we're nervous or apprehensive about those things, or had really bad experiences in the past that kind of turned them off from gaming, but they still enjoy watching, right? So there's a whole lot that kind of went into that project. But I think, again, what's relevant for this present study that we're actually talking about today is that I was finding that participants really wanted to experience game narratives, even if they didn't play the game themselves, right? So it was, again, like I have no interest in actually picking up a controller and doing myself, right? Actually playing the game, but I love the stories, and I love the characters, and I love the worlds, right? And I don't know, that really stuck with me, right? Because it's like they're not just going to go watch a movie, right? There's something about games that were like really compelling to them. And so this idea, right, game developers or publishers, hear something like that and they think, uh-oh, right? Maybe in some cases, like, okay, right, this concern that people, can get something out of watching a Let's Play video or a stream and feel satisfied, right, and not need to go play a game themselves. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec, right? A couple years ago, another study came out that was kind of talking about this, right, in a sense, of how Twitch in particular might affect consumer behavior. This idea that games, streams or Let's Play videos might function as a sort of game demo in a sense, right? Because again, there's this perception that people who would otherwise purchase a game might be able to see the whole thing played out, right? Feel kind of like they got the experience, from that game, maybe just seeing how a story ends or something like that, and they say like, oh, cool, right? I'm good, I got it, right? That was great. But now, why would I go spend, $30, $60, whatever, right, on this game? Because I feel like I've already kind of got what I wanted out of it, right? Especially if it was kind of the story. But they also talk about how there's benefits to this, such as providing visibility, in particular for indie developed games, right? Which again, as many folks know here, right, one of the big hurdles is always in marketing and promoting one's game on a big platform, competing with thousands of other indie developers, but also AAA studios as well. And so they suggest that again, these platforms might bring some visibility and some free marketing to those smaller studios projects. And then, of course, for older games, increasing the lifespan of them, right? So if you pull up a Twitch, the list of all the games that are currently being played, you'll see games that are 20 years old, right, being played on that platform, which is really neat, right? And it brings a lot of people who maybe hadn't played those games before, gets them really interested in kind of going back and saying, well, that looks awesome, let's kind of dig into that, right? So it's not, saying that this is all necessarily a kind of threatening relationship. And that's part of what we're going to kind of tease out with this project. And some of you might have seen these headlines, but I was talking about, again, with my study earlier, talking to non-players, right? Again, people who don't normally play games, saying, they watch others play to kind of get the experience they otherwise wouldn't. And this is definitely something, that a lot of publishers, that developers have voiced some concern over, right? Whether or not it's warranted, we'll kind of dig into that. But these are just a few sample headlines of what I pretty commonly saw a couple years ago. Some of you may remember this. Atlas, went so far with Persona 5 when it came out to have like a stream embargo of a sense, right? And so there was like a particular date range, right, where streamers were like told they could only showcase certain parts of the game. They weren't supposed to stream any narrative heavy segments of the game, right? Suggesting that they're very worried about this kind of phenomenon that I'm talking about, right? That people would sort of see it, not to spoil it, but maybe even deter them from them going out and wanting to play the games themselves, right? So anyway, I'll turn it over to Tylor. We'll kind of start actually talking about where we're picking up in this conversation with our own current projects.
Yeah, so generally speaking, I hopped on this project. Obviously, Steph and I are married. She's the video game person in the group. I am an economist who works primarily in the film industry, is my background. But what I was thinking as Steph was kind of describing this problem and talking through the issue is that it seems to me that a lot of the things going on here were very similar to what I was studying when I was analyzing the film industry. And in particular, I have done a lot of work on piracy in the film industry and thinking about how is that positive or negative and what are the impacts of that. And so generally speaking, what we're looking to do here is first off, just try to evaluate, do these videos generally drive increases in video game sales or do they hamper sales, right? We just want to know if a game is on Twitch or on YouTube, is that a good or a bad thing from a developer sale perspective? The other question that we're really trying to get is this something that varies from game to game? So we talked about, for example, Persona 5 seemed really concerned about this, but it seems like League of Legends is in the exact opposite direction, right? They are not only allowing streams and wanting them everywhere, they are putting out their own streams. They're designing esports leagues to get as many people as possible watching videos of their gameplay. And so, we kind of started to talk about, well, maybe narrative games play out differently than non-narrative games because you can't spoil Call of Duty, but you can absolutely spoil a role-playing game, right? Maybe multiplayer games, or like Steph was talking about, games that have kind of skill or rating levels maybe potentially matter. And even there's the possibility that AAA games, they have such big advertising budgets in many cases, they don't need Twitch to get the word out about their game, whereas indie developers might rely on this as one of the kind of major ways that they actually get information to consumers about what is the game, how does it play, why would you be interested? And so we want to kind of try to start to tease out exactly what's going on here. And to give an example of how we're going to do this, I think we're going to kind of start by talking about some of the ways that we'll try to identify what these effects look like and how they might differ from game to game. So, Steph, you're in charge of slides. Can you click for me? Thank you. So, I obviously approach this looking at how is this similar to some of the research that I have done on piracy. And when you analyze piracy in digital markets, generally speaking, there are two types of effects that we see, and they cut in opposite directions. So one of these effects is what is known as a word of mouth effect. So the basic idea here is that if I watch a pirated movie, or I listen to a pirated song, or I play a pirated video game, while I am probably less likely to buy that product, I'm also able to have some information that I can share with friends, share with those around me, and basically I can create the possibility that people who wouldn't have heard of the game or movie or whatever, or people who would have thought it was low quality, might get some new information and be interested in purchasing it who otherwise wouldn't. But the effect that it seems like developers are much more focused on, and obviously this is something that we see over and over again, is what are called substitution effects. Now, in the film industry, this is pretty straightforward. If I download a movie and watch it, I don't need to buy a ticket, because watching it on my computer and watching it in the theater are more or less the same experience, right? It's a bigger screen, it's better sound, but I have seen the movie regardless of which way I experience the movie. On the other hand, when we look at video games, this substitution effect feels like it's going to be less prominent than it is in some of the other industries that I have analyzed in the past. Because watching a game on Twitch is a fundamentally different experience from playing the game yourself, right? You have to input the commands yourself. There's some skill that you can see expressed. And if we're looking at like games that have branching narrative structures or have some sort of kind of interactive storytelling component, you can get very different outcomes depending on who's playing and what choices they're making, right? The perfect example of this is that Steph and I right now are both working our way through the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, and today I literally yelled at her for missing one of my favorite dialogue options, because how can you play that game without hearing one of the main characters sing Gilbert and Sullivan? It's not really worth playing if you don't get that dialogue option. But the idea here is that when we are studying video games, the word of mouth effect is likely still there and is still providing information flow that's useful, but the substitution effect, at least in theory, is going to be a lot smaller. And so for me, this is a really interesting kind of research tool to try to see how big can word of mouth effects be if we don't have that contravening factor of substitution constantly getting in the way. Now, in the movie industry, just as like a little bit of kind of context for what's going on here, generally speaking, the conclusion has been that both word of mouth and substitution effects exist, but substitution effects are much larger than word of mouth effects. So for every time someone downloads a movie illegally, they may have a 60% lower chance of buying that movie, and they would have like a 2% higher chance of convincing someone else to buy the movie. So there is a positive effect of piracy, but it's so small that we can all, in the research community, kind of agree piracy is bad. Like, that's just the conclusion we end up drawing. But as we start to move forward with this study, I think we see that the video game industry is a little bit more nuanced. Click to next slide. That's maybe the best way for me to do this. So what did we do? Well, I got a grant from my institution. I used it to pay someone to do a whole bunch of coding in C++, basically, and they created a scraping app for us, where basically we gave them the name of a game and the console that it was for, and then it would go on both Twitch and YouTube and just get data on every single video that is currently available for that game, right? So what we're looking at here basically is like, if we have the #1 selling game of all time, we would then search on Twitch, get a list of every video, and for each of those videos, we would record what was the name of the video, what was its duration, how many views does it have, how many likes, how many dislikes, what was the name of the person who uploaded it, and we're able to grab a couple other pieces of metadata. So we have like the total number of comments, although we're not able to scrape all of the comments, it would just be way too data intensive. And we also have some basic information about like any tags that are given to the video. So we know that if someone tagged a video as like first person shooter, or they tag it as tutorial, or they tag it as something like that, we can use those tags to identify certain types of videos as being different from others. Now, we have a list of the 10,000 best-selling titles. We have how many dollars in sales they earned. That is from vgcharts.com. And then what we do basically is for each game, we say, here is the game, here is how much money it makes. And once we add together all of the videos, we have for that game, what were the total number of videos, what were the total number of views, and we can also create some other aggregate data. But the main data that we're looking at is for each game, how much money did it make, how many videos are there, and how many views are there of those videos. Now, we had originally designed the scraping program to basically set it on a computer and forget it. And then it turns out that my work computer sucks and it broke it. And so we kind of stopped about a quarter of the way through the data. And our plan was, okay, we've got this baseline, we can do some simple tests, we can kind of verify that things make sense, and then we can go to our PC at home, which is much more powerful, put it on there, let it do the scraping, and we'll have all the data by like the end of 2020. And then COVID happened, and we needed to use that home computer to work and not to scrape data 24/7. So as of right now, what we have is data on about 1.3 million videos out of what in 2019 we were estimating would probably be a final data set in the 10 to 12 million video range. Now, you'll notice that we have 1.3 million videos from 4,300 games, and yet we're saying we anticipate 12 million videos total. Well, the reason that this is happening is that the way our scraping program works is it is randomly selecting games from the list, so that if we had to stop in the middle like we did, we didn't just have data on the top 500 games. We had data on some top selling games, some bottom selling games, some middle selling games. We've got kind of everything we need to do a decent analysis, even though we know we're missing some of the biggest games that are listed here. Now, a couple things I do want to note about this data set before we dive into any results, because when you have data this big, it's really easy to lose the forest for the trees. So a couple things here. Number one is that what we have is sales data. So we have the total number of copies that are sold, and we have the price of each copy, so we can get a total revenue that is earned from selling the game. But it's worth noting that we don't have any data on sales of DLC content. We don't have any data on sales of microtransactions. And crucially, games that have a price of 0, that is games that are free to play with some sort of premium revenue mechanic, are not going to show up on our list at all, right? Because if you look at League of Legends, for example, it's an extremely profitable game, but its sales total is 0, because if you want that game, you don't have to pay any money to get it. You pay lots of money for skins and events passes and all sorts of other things, but those aren't in our data set. And the other thing that's worth noting here is that this data set goes all the way back. So we do have like some Atari games in our data set, if they to this day remain one of the top 10,000 sellers of all time. Now, that top 10,000 number is pretty arbitrary. We picked it because that's as far as VG Charts lets us go without causing issues with just copy pasting the data into an Excel spreadsheet effectively. But that ends up being, I want to say the number was, that is every game that has earned more than, I think it's like $10,000 or something like that. So it is a cutoff. It does cut off quite a few very small indie games, but it definitely includes kind of the main ecosystem of games that we would expect to have a wide audience on sites like Twitch or YouTube. So that's our data as it stands right now. So what are we doing? the basic idea here is we want to predict how does revenue relate to the number of views of videos, the number of videos that are posted. So the basic analysis we're doing is just saying, do games that have more views make more money, and do games that have more videos make more money? Now, the problem with that sort of simple correlation analysis is that it's really obvious that games that make more money have more views on Twitch and YouTube, right? And games that make more money have more videos on Twitch and YouTube. And the reason is pretty obvious, because if a game has more sales, it has a much bigger player base. And so there's more people who are interested in watching the video. And that's not an especially interesting answer, right? We just end up saying these things are correlated. But the problem that we run into is that the correlation is what we call bidirectional, right? So the thing that ends up happening is we know that revenue creates views. Games that have more sales are going to be watched more. But what's unclear is, do views create revenue? And the problem is, with just a simple kind of correlation-based analysis, we can't separate out the direction of the effect, right? We just see they're positively correlated, but we don't know if it's because A causes B or if it's because B causes A, right? And what we really care about in this analysis is not, does revenue create views? What we care about is, do views create revenue, right? If people watch your game, does it make more money after those views exist? And so one way that we're working on identifying that direction is by including this third variable that we are calling post-Twitch. So basically what this is for every game in our data set, we know when it was released. And so we are able to code whether the game was released before Twitch existed or whether the game was released after Twitch existed. And then what we do is we include that variable and do what's called an interaction with the number of views and the number of videos. And the basic idea here is that what we are assuming is that video games who came out before Twitch existed, they can only have one direction of the effect between revenue and views. Because if we're looking at like Super Mario Brothers, that is a game where it's obvious that revenue can create views for that game, but it's almost impossible to think that views created revenue for Super Mario Brothers, right? Because that's an NES game. It's not for sale anymore. And so from the day Twitch went on and after, there's more or less $0 in sales for a game like Super Mario Brothers that is generated as a result of views. On the other hand, for games that released after Twitch was released, we can see that both directions of the effect could exist, right? Revenue could create views, but views could also create revenue. And so by comparing what effect does Twitch seem to have on games released before that platform existed, and what effect does views have on games released after Twitch was affected, we're hoping to more or less be able to isolate the two different directions of the effect and measure them independently. Now, there's lots of statistical problems that can come along with this, and there are a variety of really messy ways that we can deal with some of the problems that we have statistically. But one of the kind of simplest ones that normally we wouldn't be able to do, but it turns out to work in this, is what we're addressing down in this kind of bottom note here, which is that normally, if you included views and videos in a regression analysis like this, it would basically confuse your stats program, because games that have more videos are almost guaranteed to have more views. And so your program would have a really hard time figuring out, is it views that are related to revenue or is it videos? And it couldn't really separate that out. But it turns out when it comes to Twitch data and YouTube data also, that these two things actually don't correlate with one another nearly as strongly as we would have expected, right? So one thing that we find is that there are actually a fairly large number of games that have lots of videos posted, and each of those videos only has like 12 views. And there are also a decently large number of games that only have, say, 100 videos, but all 100 of those videos have multi-million numbers of views. And so as a result of that kind of interesting fact that those two things don't correlate with one another, we're actually able to kind of get some ability to parse apart what effects are happening where and with which games. And that's something we're trying to take advantage of to really get into the nitty-gritty of this relationship rather than just the big picture, these two things are correlated analysis. Click. So what do we find? First off, views don't seem to have a statistically significant effect on the revenue of game studios once you control for the fact that some games were released before Twitch and some games were released after, right? Once we handle all of that time-based statistical messiness, we basically find that more viewers don't increase revenue or decrease revenue, right? And we tend to think that this is probably more or less proxying for that substitution effect, right? We're not seeing a whole lot of people who say, I really want to play Mass Effect, then watch a YouTube video of it and say, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to watch Mass Effect anymore. But we do find that there is a positive correlation between the number of uploaded videos and the sales of video games. And this is really interesting to us because it says something about the fact that when people are enthusiastic enough about a game to post it, that seems to create some value for the developers. It actually generates sales regardless of whether the view totals are higher or lower for a game like that. So one kind of very simple, straightforward story that we can get out of this is that at least at the basic level, it feels like views are something that would affect that substitution effect. You either watch a video or you play a game. That doesn't seem to be happening. Whereas uploads, you actually have to have the game to upload video of it. And so this is all about that like word of mouth enthusiasm effect with no possibility of substitution playing out there. So if anything, the simple kind of big picture analysis of Twitch videos and YouTube videos and what effect they have actually seems to illustrate that some of the fears about Twitch and YouTube are a little bit overblown. It seems like they're actually helping the industry significantly more than they're hurting the industry, at least in terms of upfront sales numbers. Click. So more or less what we've got here is instead of a substitution effect and a word of mouth effect, here, we're actually, I think, in the video game industry, more dealing with a substitution effect and an enthusiasm effect, right? In the film industry, the problem that we run into is that people who pirate a movie necessarily won't buy it. But in the video game industry, people who upload a game necessarily have bought it. And so the question isn't, are you trading off between watching and playing? It's actually when you play a game, how likely are you to say, you know what, I want other people to experience this? And the more you can generate that sort of enthusiasm from your players, the bigger the impact of Twitch is going to be. And interestingly, that seems to be true even if you have a lot of really enthusiastic players who are uploading their video and playing it for their 4 friends, right? And so what we're seeing here is that while Twitch is obviously, it's a useful tool, it seems to be promoting games, there's also some evidence that it's not actually about getting people watching the streams. It's about getting people who are so psyched that they're probably telling their friends about the game constantly and also uploading videos of their gameplay. Click. So this is awesome. I'm super psyched. We have 1.3 million videos. That's the biggest data set I've ever worked with, and it's only 1/10 of the way done. But we want to be cautious about overhyping these results before we get the full data set. So short-term problems, what are some of the limitations we're dealing with? One, we've got about 1/10 of the videos we eventually expect, and we are going to have some trouble with the way the data is working right now, because one of the things that we eventually hope to be able to use as another identification strategy is we want to be able to note that there are some games who either don't have any videos or have very limited numbers of videos because of copyright claims, right? So for the most part, video games streaming is considered to be perfectly legal, right? If you play a game and upload your video of it, 99% of studios say, congratulations, you've done an awesome thing, go ahead and do it. But there are some studios who consider videos that use their game to be illegal copyright theft. Right? These studios would say, this is our game, you're using our code, our user license agreement doesn't allow you to upload videos, and therefore shutdown notices sometimes get sent. And of all of the studios that do this, the one that's most notorious for it in the modern day is Nintendo, who, if your video that includes their game has any modification whatsoever, they get angry. And they will, in many cases, just shut down large numbers of videos. There was also a really interesting example of this that we kind of watched in real time, probably about 2 years ago, where a very popular mod to one of the Halo games was considered to be in violation of the terms of use on Halo. And so literally over about 24 hours, something like 70 to 80% of one of the Halo games had all of the videos removed from Twitch. And so you could literally see in real time basically the copyright holder sending notices out to Twitch and YouTube. And it was just watching these videos vanish from the situation. And so eventually we would really love to use that as a statistical advantage, right? To be able to say, if Nintendo is shutting down Twitch, there is a clear example of a set of games that will have high sales and low views, but it's not because people aren't interested in the game. It's simply because Nintendo is artificially lowering the number of videos. And right now, the problem that we have with our data is that because the scraping program is randomly picking games, right now we don't know if a game has 0 videos, whether that's because the developer is stopping it or simply because our scraping program hasn't gotten to scraping that game yet. So there are some statistical techniques that we eventually want to take advantage of that we just can't until all 10,000 games are fully scraped. Long term, a couple things we have to deal with. One is that when you have a data set this big, everything looks a little bit significant just because you literally have 10 million degrees of freedom. And so it's a matter of designing statistical techniques that actually make sure you account for that and are dealing with the specific things you're looking at, rather than just like, if we data mined this data set, it would just say like every developer has a statistically significant effect on revenue. And that's probably not true, but we need to make sure we take care of it. And then the last thing is just right now, we just have a very simple, straightforward date variable that says like games released in 2020 probably have a different relationship with Twitch than games released in 2016. But there's a lot more nuance we want to include. Things like variables for different console generations, or for for example, we might want to include something about, the introduction of Steam if we're looking at PC games, because they possibly have some, social aspects of their own that wouldn't necessarily be available to some games that were released before or after some of those developments. So these are all things that we just want to be really careful about. We have results that we're pretty comfortable with and think are really interesting and cool, but we want to just highlight that we are far from done with this study. And as soon as Steph goes back to work at an office with her own computer, we can scrape the rest of the data and kind of move on with things. But for now, we're kind of stuck in preliminary results land.
Yeah.
Click.
Yeah. All right. Alrighty, I can talk a little bit about this. So to kind of summarize, right, some of what we've been talking about here. So one thing we found is that, again, watching or the view counts themselves, right, were not what seemed to have a big impact on sales based on what data we have so far. So as Tylor was saying earlier, right, we don't see that substitution effect, right? So because I watch a game doesn't necessarily mean that I'm now going to not go out and purchase it, right? In fact, in some cases, we may see the inverse of this, right? The enthusiasm effect that we were talking about, right? So that's where the number of uploaded videos, right, becomes sort of the signifier of that, right? We'll kind of get into this, but certain types of games seem to be particularly effective at generating a high level of enthusiasm within the VGC industry, which then may also seem to increase sales, right? So it's not so watching isn't so much a threat, right, as far as we can see so far. But uploading does suggest, again, good news, I think, right, but a boost for a lot of game sales. What we don't know is that the number of videos caused the increase of game sales. So this is what Tylor was saying earlier. We have to be really careful about, because there is some sort of relationship there, saying that one causes the other, right? It might just be, as you said, that games that obviously, right, if they sell better, they may just have more videos, again, because I have to actually own the game in order to be able to then stream it, right? Although I guess people could pirate it. I don't know how we can control for that. I suppose we can't, but assuming they purchase it, right? Which is an assumption on our part, I guess. So again, that's just kind of, reiterating what Tylor, I think, has done a good job of already kind of breaking down. But something that's really cool, one of the sort of implications for this, aside from just the sales data, is that, again, while we don't see any evidence here overwhelmingly to suggest that streaming or Let's Play videos, right, or any kind of gaming content videos are hurting sales, we do have strong reason to suspect that some types of games, whether that's genre or multiplayer games, can strongly benefit from building communities through video game content, right? So, I think, again, multiplayer games are a big part of this, because the experience is going to be radically different, based on who's playing it, right? We're not watching somebody just sort of navigate a very linear narrative focused RPG, right? Which might take away some of that experience for us. Whereas, watching pro players play, CSGO, right? High level competition, can provide a lot of, again, stimulation for audiences that you can't really substitute for, right? And so I think that's, something worth noting, right? That this can actually be a strength that a lot of games can sort of play into, including, many indie games, right?
Yeah, there's actually one thing I want to add here, and then also I want to respond to one question in the chat.
Yeah.
So first off, just to note here, we started to do some of the more granular analysis of looking at, are certain genres seem to have, say, larger word of mouth effects or larger substitution effects? Do indie developers or AAA developers seem to have different effects? And what we found was some really interesting stuff. So for example, multiplayer games seem to have a slightly larger enthusiasm effect than non-multiplayer games. And the really interesting thing we found is that games that were tagged as either being story-driven or indie games actually did see it was a small word of mouth effect, but there was a negative word of mouth effect that basically it seems like games that can be spoiled, there is some evidence that that happens and that people do actually buy slightly less. The problem that we have is that because we only have a tenth of the videos, is that the statistical significance on those results wasn't enough for us to be really confident in saying, let's say this is the case. So I think when we look at the broader data set, eventually, the end result is going to be multiplayers love Twitch, single player story driven games. The story is a little bit hazier, but we don't really have the statistical power to be drawing those conclusions solidly at this point. There's some evidence that it might be the case, but not fully. And in the chat, someone asked about COVID influencing the data set. And this is a really awesome question. The shortest and best answer I can give is probably when we first write the initial version of the paper, it's just going to be based on data up to 2019, because I want to sidestep this question. It's really, really hard. Like you say, I don't quite know how you identify what's a trend and what's a permanent shift in behavior. But that being said, I think as soon as we write the first version of the paper, I already have 8 ideas in my head of what to do with just the data from 2020. And so for me, I think the answer is the COVID trend versus permanent shift question. What I want is I want to see 2021 data. So then I can look at how much does it go back to where it was before. And this is actually weirdly a strength of mine. Structural break models are the way that we would handle this. And this is the thing I do in my life statistically. So I am thrilled to answer your question, but I think the best answer is like sometime in mid 2022. I think I'll have a much better kind of way of addressing that issue. And in the short term, I'm literally just going to ignore the COVID year because it's really hard to deal with.
Yeah, which is how pretty much every media industry research project is handling, because 2020 was such an outlier. So yeah, I would second all of that. So one other thing that I wanted to add, just because a recent area of research that I've gotten really interested in is, like, again, people who are interested in gaming culture but don't necessarily wouldn't identify as players, right? Hence the project earlier. And so, you know, one other kind of takeaway from this outside of sales data is also just thinking about the many ways that fans of gaming franchises can engage with gaming culture beyond just playing. And I know, like, from a developer standpoint, right, that's like what everybody primarily cares about. But I also think, like, thinking about the repercussions this has on merchandise and convention attendance or other, you know, book spin-offs or things like that. Again, having, you know, talked to people who, again, don't play games but are avid fans of you know, Mass Effect, right, or whatever it is. Like, they just love those characters from watching other people play, or, you know, even sitting on the couch, right, and watching like a partner play or something. And I think that's a whole market that sometimes goes kind of overlooked, but is nonetheless really viable financially, but also just like culturally kind of neat. And so I think too, like, about you know, thinking about how many people in your audience, right? Like, they wouldn't necessarily be buying your game anyways, but, you know, say you do have merchandise, right, or events held around your game, thinking about other ways those people become sources of, you know, revenue kind of horizontally, right? So yeah, just something I kind of wanted to throw out there. Future work, like, real quickly, I think we've already kind of touched on this, and we'll leave time for like a little bit more questions, I think. But again, balancing the substitution effect and the enthusiasm effect. Again, we think that this will probably differ for indie games, like we said, especially particularly narrative games, right? Again, suggesting that we saw a little bit of this, but based on our small data set, relatively small data set still, compared to where we plan to be, we're not totally comfortable, you know, making that bold claim yet. But that's something that we look to test more rigorously in the near future. Again, whether streaming permissions affect enthusiasm or substitution. So again, the copyright infringement, you know, type of issue, right, that was raised earlier. And then also some more video-specific metadata might give us some other insights on streamers' motivations, right? Like, are you posting this to be a review? Are you posting this to be kind of spoilery, right? Or like, what's kind of going on there, and how that might affect how audiences sort of receive that experience, right? All right, that is it. I put our contact info up here if you want to get in touch with either of us. Here we are. I'll leave that slide up, and then I think we've got like 10 minutes left for questions or comments, or, you know, whatever thoughts people have. We would love to hear them. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah. I love the party favor emote. That's awesome.
I know, it's really awesome. I also really love this couch. I wish I got to sit on a couch at actual conferences. It'd be so much better.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hey, Phil.
Hey, so I've been excited to hear about the details of this ever since you mentioned it like years ago at a Game Loop breakout
like
room.
2 years ago, I know.
Yeah. So that was really cool. It was all sorts of exciting things that you know, I can't wait to hear more about. All the things that you guys teased looking into. One of the things that stood out to me about the split between videos that have lots of situations where there's lots of videos and very few views versus the ones where I think the example was like there's like 10 videos that have thousands or millions of views. Yeah. I'm wondering if like there might be something interesting there with like who published those. You mentioned that you had that data, and whether those are posted by the company that made it or an official media outlet, or a journalist that does a lot of that, and whether that is like actually official like advertising content versus like fan stuff that could be spoilery or is like, you know, something that might be like more suspect of like, you know, something that the developer wouldn't necessarily want to be shown for a narrative game, for instance.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's it.
So actually, one of the things with our scraping program is that there are 2 keywords that are included that if a video has them, we actually drop that video.
Oh, cool.
And those are trailer and review.
Nice.
So we're hoping to exclude a decent amount of what you have, but like if people don't tag it as that, they're in there. One of the things that I think we're trying to do once we have the full data set, or that I hope we're able to do, is I'm really curious to look at, what percentage of the people who are uploading videos of a game are single game posters and how many are multiple game posters, because I think that's going to be something that lets us get at exactly what you're describing, right? Because like the Mass Effect official Twitch page is going to have a bunch of Mass Effect videos, but that's not nearly the same as like someone who plays games on Twitch who plays Mass Effect for a while and then switches to some other game, right? And so that I think is how we're going to try to get at that issue. But this is definitely, it's a problem I deal with in movies all the time, because the economic term for what you're describing is these goods are what are called information goods, where you don't know the quality of them until after you play them or watch a video. And so we kind of want to identify, are videos informative and actually let you know something about the quality, or are they uninformative, which is usually what like trailers and reviews are, right? They tell you like EA thinks this is a good game, but that doesn't actually mean anything about whether it's a good game.
Yeah, that's awesome. Anyway, thank you so much. That was really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna say, like, this is a thing that I think many people who are interested in games have been thinking about for such a long time, and making the assumption that, like, obviously the conclusion you came to is the correct one, right? Like, obviously people who actually engage with this content and engage with Twitch and engage with YouTube, we know this is true, but we've been, you know, having those beliefs and actually having data to back it up is a very different thing. I feel like more empowered to have good ideas, like good opinions about streaming and you know, limitations on media like this. Like, thank you so much for doing this. This is such a cool thing.
Oh, well, I had this idea. I've been like kicking it around for a while, but I was like, I would love to. And Tylor was like, I have the formula to do that. So like this literally like my idea and then his methodology for executing it. So thank him, because I am not stats minded at all. But thank you so much. That means a lot. Looks like
yeah. So Katie has a question in the chat. So the tricky thing to answer your question is the way that VG Charts organizes its game sales data is it organizes it by a title and a platform. So what we have seen, for example, is that if Super Mario Brothers 3 has a lot of videos, that seems to increase sales of like the Super Mario Brothers Switch collection, right? But the problem is that you don't typically see older games seeing their sales increase directly for console games, at least, because once the generation is over, there aren't a whole lot of sales. So what we can definitely identify and what we can definitely see is that like Mass Effect 2 streams seem to greatly benefit Mass Effect Legendary Edition streams. And from, I think, a developer perspective and from my perspective, that means that streams are increasing sales and increasing the longevity of games over time. But from a like technically, statistically sales perspective, the Legendary Edition and Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3 are different games because they're on different consoles and they're re-released and remastered. So it's actually a really tricky question to get into the details of. I think we find a lot of anecdotal evidence kind of in the data that suggests exactly what you're describing, but it's really hard to pick apart, are people playing Super Mario 3 because it's available on the Switch now? Is it people who would have bought it anyway just because they love the game, or are they discovering the game on Twitch and then buying the new version of it? I don't know if we have a good answer for that, but it's a really good question that I think is worth trying to parse out.
We could do a qualitative follow-up study in the future. That'd be something with like interviews that would be helpful to get into. But yeah.
And as soon as you say qualitative, I'm out. But
my next project. But yeah, the stats can get complicated for sure.
Yeah.
Great point though.
Well, I think we're just like a minute or two away from the break. So I think I'm probably going to like head over into the networking area if people have more questions or want to talk about things. That sounds great. But thanks, everybody. These were super great questions, and you were an awesome audience. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.